Hello, Newark Baptist Church, and welcome to our weekly Bible study. Let's pray. Our Father, we ask, Lord, that the Holy Spirit would guide and direct us into all truth tonight. In Jesus' name, amen. So, we are continuing our ongoing series called Understanding the Jews, and tonight's lesson is entitled Solomon, Man of Great Wisdom and Great Folly. This is now lesson number 165, and as you can tell, we have finally moved past Absalom and David, and we're going to talk about the man Solomon. Of course, the name of Solomon invokes many thoughts among both the Jews and non-Jews alike. For the most part, that name is revered as being attached to the wisest man that ever lived. And that's true enough. Solomon was the wisest man until he wasn't. When Solomon was right, he was very right. But when he was wrong, he was very wrong. Solomon was a man who was blessed with much wisdom, and he started out with great promise, but he ended his life in disgrace and folly. And probably the main reason that Solomon is mostly remembered in such a positive light is owed to the Jewish people. Many of the Jews made a conscious choice. Well, certainly not all, because there are ample Jewish scholars that have called him to account for his shortcomings, particularly as he got later into his life. But there are many Jews who have come to focus their attention on the early part of Solomon's life and not the latter. And that intentional emphasis has kept the name of Solomon in high regard right down to the present day. Now, in the Hebrew, the name Solomon is Shlomo, and it's still a popular name among the Jews, not so much here in America, although there are a respectable number. But that name is much more popular in the nation of Israel itself. In fact, a man named Shlomo Amar is the current Sephardic chief rabbi of Jerusalem. And practicing Jews still wear the name of Shlomo, or Solomon, with a sense of pride. Now, the life of Solomon, the acts of Solomon, are recorded in many books of the Bible, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And if we're all being honest, the first thing that comes to our minds when we hear the name is not spiritual decline and failure. Instead, the name of Solomon gives us thoughts of wisdom, glory, splendor, and power. Those are the things that have been the inspiration for numerous books and movies. But clearly, this was a very complicated man. And because his legacy was so well known among the people, and it surely was, the name of Solomon is invoked over and over by historians and prophets in the Old Testament and by the disciples of Christ, and even by Christ himself in the New Testament. There is no doubt that the average Jew, the everyday citizen of Israel, as found in the Scriptures, was well acquainted with King Solomon. Their affection for him and the way in which they remember him has much to do with Solomon being the man who brought the nation of Israel to the very apex of its glory and influence among all the nations of the earth. Of course, problem with reaching the apex is what? There's only one place to go, and that's down. And that's exactly what happened. And it wasn't a slow, steady decline. It was precipitous. Solomon's body was barely cold in the grave before the glory of a united Israel was all but gone. So, as you can well imagine, there must be lessons to be learned by the rise and fall of Israel's most glorious king. And Solomon's spiritual life exhibits a definite arc, a rapid ascent into the heights, followed by a decline into sin, failure. And the scriptures spend a lot of time and space on documenting both the successes and the failures of Israel's third king. In the Old Testament, you'll find him in the books of 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Nehemiah, Psalms, Proverbs, Song of Songs, and Jeremiah. And in the New Testament, we find him in Matthew and Luke, and in the book of Acts. So if you were counting, that's no less than 13 books of the Bible. And he is referred to so many times because whenever his name was mentioned, everybody knew who you were talking about. Solomon was famous. And the visions of grandeur that people had in their minds, well, that made Solomon ripe for object lessons and endless comparisons that could be made with many and various subjects. So, where do we begin with King Solomon? In previous lessons, we really haven't been able to avoid bringing him into our discussions. Some of them involve King David, others Solomon's brothers, and still others, well, the kingdom of Israel in general. And because of that, I wrestled with the approach I wanted to take. Should we be led by events, by issues, by chronology? Well, in the end, I settled on a combination of all three. So in order to do that, we're going to look at Solomon by following what I'm calling a loose timeline. A loose timeline of his life. Loose, meaning that, well, we'll start at the beginning and we'll proceed chronologically, but we're going to do it by stopping to consider certain inflection points along the way. Not every little detail, but those things that tend to stand out as being more significant. So with that in mind, let's begin with the circumstances that surrounded King Solomon's birth. So for that, we're going to go to 2 Samuel 12 and 2 verses 24 and 25. The scripture reads, "And David comforted Bathsheba his wife, and went in unto her, and lay with her. And she bare a son, and he called his name Solomon, and the Lord loved him. And he, the Lord, sent by the hand of Nathan the prophet, and he called his name Jedediah, because of the Lord." Now, verse 24 here says that David comforted his wife Bathsheba. Because, if you remember, their first son had been conceived in sin. Bathsheba had become pregnant by David while she was still yet married to Uriah the Hittite. And that illegitimate son had died as an infant. So, we see here that David and Bathsheba have a second son, Solomon. And this second son has no such curse on him. In fact, the scriptures say that God loved him. This is quite a distinct dichotomy of favor. The first son was not permitted to live, whereas the second son was literally born into the loving arms of God. So much so that God sent the prophet Nathan to inform David and Bathsheba that God himself had given this child a name. The name of Jedediah. And Jedediah means beloved of the Lord. Now the name Solomon means peace. It's where we get the greeting, shalom. That's the word I use at the end of all of our lessons from week to week. Shalom. So when we add it all together, we see that this new child represents both peace with God and love from God. The circumstances surrounding the first child caused enmity with God. But not so the second child, and hence the reestablishment of peace between David and his God. In fact, in this verse 24, we find for the first time that Bathsheba is referred to as David's wife, where heretofore she was called the wife of Uriah, even after Uriah had died. And to confirm that newfound notion of peace, Nathan himself brought in person the appellation of God's love that he bestowed on this newborn babe, Solomon. Now this naming ceremony, so to speak, and the distinct mention of God's love directed to Solomon was something quite unique. We know that King David had at least 19 sons, perhaps more. But I don't believe that it is recorded of any other son of David that God said explicitly that he loved that son from his very birth. Only Solomon was the recipient of that great honor. Now, the reason that we started with Solomon's birth needs no explanation. It's literally the beginning for him. But I emphasize the name that was given to him and its circumstances for an important reason. And that is because a number of David's sons were going to desire the throne of their father. And two of them, Adonijah and Absalom, thought that they were so deserving of it that they endeavored to take it by force. And we've studied both of those failed attempts in previous lessons. But King David made a choice that it was going to be Solomon who would follow him to the throne. and surely the message that David received concerning Solomon at the time of his birth would have been part of his thinking when the time came for that choice to be made. Of course, there were additional elements of consideration that were consistent with Solomon rising to the top of the list for successorship to the king, or the kingship. We studied how his mother, Bathsheba, recognized, and promoted her son Solomon as the rightful heir. And she received a promise from David that he too would support Solomon's ascension. And of course, there was that prophet, Nathan. And it was not only that Nathan was the one who brought God's message of his love for Solomon at the time of Solomon's birth, but it was also Nathan who spurned Adonijah's attempt to take the throne, and he openly supported Solomon. So, two people, Nathan and Bathsheba, two people that David respected and trusted, were advising David to carry through with his promise to elevate Solomon above his other sons. Those were weighty endorsements. And finally, we have King David when he had gotten to the point where he was making plans to build a new temple in Jerusalem. God came to David to tell him that because he had shed so much blood in his life, he would not be the one to do it, but rather it would be Solomon. Let's go to that scene, 1 Chronicles 28, verses 2 through 6. Scripture reads, "Then David the king stood up upon his feet and said, 'Hear me, my brethren and my people. As for me, I had in mine heart to build an house of rest for the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and for the footstool of our God, and had made ready for the building. But God said unto me, Thou shalt not build an house for my name, because thou hast been a man of war, and hast shed blood. Howbeit, the Lord God of Israel chose me before all the house of my father to be king over Israel forever. For he hath chosen Judah to be the ruler, and of the house of Judah, the house of my father, and among the sons of my father he liked me to make me king over all Israel. And all of my sons, for the Lord hath given me many sons. He hath chosen Solomon my son to sit upon the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. And he said unto me, Solomon thy son, he shall build my house and my courts. For I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father.'" Now, as we have seen in studying David's relationships with his other sons, Absalom in particular, it would be hard to make the case that Solomon was David's favorite. He wasn't. That Solomon was the apple of his eye. No. But when it came right down to it, David understood it really wasn't his choice. It was God's choice. And it's not like God didn't make it perfectly clear He was clear, all right. God said unequivocally in verse 6 that we just read, I have chosen him. Now, if there's one thing that David learned from King Saul, it's this. It is better to obey. Now, in the case of Saul, it was better for him to obey than to sacrifice. But the greater meaning is certain, and that is, you can substitute anything you want in place of the word sacrifice. Anything that includes the notion that your own personal wisdom or discernment can displace or supersede obedience to God. It doesn't. Didn't work out well for King Saul, and it wouldn't have worked out for David or for any of us. So while, yes, there were other factors mitigating in Solomon's favor, factors that we just went over, the fact that God, without reservation, had selected Solomon, well, that puts an end. When he claims for grievances that might arise from David's other sons, notwithstanding, they may be older, they may be better looking, stronger, taller, even smarter. Yes, I said smarter, because most of his other brothers were in fact smarter at the time. I'm talking about the time of King David's address to the people in 1 Chronicles chapter 28. That's when he informed Israel about God's choice to be the next king. It would be Solomon. And on that day, Solomon was not yet smart. Not by a long shot. But irrespective of how he may have been viewed by some, Solomon became the crown prince of Israel. So now we have covered two things. First, Solomon is born in Jerusalem to David and Bathsheba. And second, he is born into God's love and favor, and he has been named by God as heir to David's throne. So the only thing that needs to happen now for Solomon to make his ascension is for King David to either abdicate the throne or for David to pass from the scene. So as we have already studied, there came a time when David's son, Adonijah, sought to usurp the throne for himself. David quickly sent his servants to make Solomon king before Adonijah could complete his plans for a royal coup. I just want to read a scant few verses to refresh our memories about that incident. That's in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 32 through 35. Scripture reads, And King David said, Call me Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada. And they came before the king. The king also said unto them, Take with you the servants of your Lord, and cause Solomon my son to ride upon mine own mule, and bring him down to Gihon. And let Zadok the priest, and Nathan the prophet, anoint him there king over Israel. And blow ye the trumpet, and say, God save King Solomon. Then ye shall come up after him, that he may come and sit upon my throne, for he shall be king in my stead. and I have appointed him to be ruler over Israel and over Judah. So that is what took place. While David was yet alive, he stepped away from the throne and made Solomon king. David abdicated. So Solomon became king while David, his father, was still alive. But it was shortly afterwards that David did actually pass. So I'm going to skip there very quickly now. 1 Kings, this will be chapter 2, first 3 verses. Scriptures read, Now the days of David drew nigh that he should die. And he charged Solomon his son, saying, I go the way of all the earth. Be thou strong, therefore, and show thyself a man. And keep the charge of the Lord thy God, to walk in his ways, to keep his statutes and his commandments and his judgments and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that thou mayest prosper in all that thou doest, and whithersoever thou turnest thyself. So on his deathbed, David gives Solomon some instruction and some advice. And he starts out with what is most important. Namely, that Solomon should remember his God, to keep his precepts as the guiding light of his reign. Good advice, amen? And then David goes on, gets into some details involving a few matters that Solomon will need to clean up. But I want to leave those particular matters for just a little bit later. At present, I want to skip down now to verses 10 and 11 of that same chapter. That's about 7 verses later. And that's for the purpose of covering the next inflection point. 1 Kings 2, 10 and 11. Scripture reads, So David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And the days that David reigned over Israel were 40 years. 7 years reigned he in Hebron, and 33 years reigned he in Jerusalem. So we see that for a short time anyway, Solomon was serving as king while David was still alive. And technically, Solomon did have full authority as king and had the right of final decision. But as long as David was still around, there would be those who would still be seeking after David, looking for his advice and his opinion. It's just something that people do. That's the very reason that our founding pastor here at Newark Baptist, Pastor Lee Boffman, physically left the area for a while immediately after his retirement. And he did that so his successor, Clayton Mormon, could get firmly established as pastor in his own right without anybody looking over his shoulder. The point being that King Solomon would not truly be on his own so long as David was still present. But now David was gone. There was no former king in the picture. There was only Solomon. No one else to look to, no one else to seek kingly counsel, just Solomon. Now there is a variance of opinion as to how old Solomon was when he took the throne. And the range goes from 12 years old up to the early 20s. And it seems that by a preponderance of the evidence, the truth is probably closer to 12. So, I have mentioned a few minutes ago that before he died, King David gave some advice to Solomon concerning some things that he would need to address before they became a bigger problem. Now, we should know, I think we should know, that it wasn't only God who had been watching the developments in Israel. I'm talking about spiritual being here. And that one of those others would, of course, be Satan. He sees that David, a man after God's own heart, has passed from the throne. And now he has been replaced by a young kid who essentially doesn't know a darn thing. He's a babe in the faith, and he's a babe to the throne. So, Satan too was well aware of the issues that David had raised with Solomon before his death. But he didn't do anything with them. Instead, he just waited. And then, right after David died, at a time when Solomon no longer had his counsel available, it was then that Satan decided to stir those matters up. Lord willing, that's where I want to resume our study of Solomon next week. So please, in the intervening week, remember to pray for all those on our prayer list. And until next time, shalom.